The Pat Kenny Show on News Talk.
With Mater Private Network. During current restrictions, don't ignore your health concerns. Our expert team is ready to help.
Now, the United States and Russia have agreed to return ambassadors to their respective countries as US President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin described their high-stakes meeting in Geneva as constructive. However, progress on the issues of cybersecurity and human rights was slower, and the US President issued a warning to the Russian leader that there will be devastating consequences for his country should opposition figure Alexei Navalny die in prison. For more on this, we're joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University of Birmingham and Editor-in-Chief of EA Worldview. Scott, good morning.
Good morning to you, Pat.
A couple of things. It finished early. They ran out of things to say to each other, it appears.
Well, Biden gave an explanation for that in his press conference where he said, well, look, we've known each other for a long time. We know what the issues are out there. So at the end of 2 hours, we just sort of looked at each other and he shrugged his shoulders. In other words, they'd covered the ground, they'd staked out their positions. And then they could bring in, the advisors for the bigger talks, the wider talks for another hour. Because, Pat, I think there were some in the media, not you, but some in the media who were looking for like some type of, great resolution to come out of this, like Reagan and Gorbachev in the 1980s. That was never going to happen. Vladimir Putin is not going to suddenly free the opposition figure, Alexei Navalny, from prison. He's not going to give back Crimea after seizing it in 2014. He's not going to halt the pressure immediately, at least, on areas like the Baltic states. And Biden knows that. So instead, rather than looking for like hours and hours of talks to get to like a defined conclusion, I think Biden took the initiative. Biden took the initiative with that one phrase that he set out from the start in a very firm, clear press conference: basic rules of the road. In other words, here are the general areas that we're concerned about: Russia's cyber attacks, Russia's failure of actions in places like Eastern Europe, Russia's interference in elections, not just in the U.S., but also in Europe as well. Are you going to get to the basic rules of the road, President Putin, or are we going to have to see you lose your credibility and face pressure from not just the United States, but from an allied front that, of course, we hadn't seen in the past few years between Washington and other countries?
Now, on the issue of cybersecurity, and Putin's response was most cybersecurity attacks emanate from within the United States, which may be true, ransomware and so on. But the idea that Biden said we have to have the rules of the road, no targeting of utilities, in other words, the electricity grids and things like that. But that almost seems to bless the criminals who do these things with the aura of business people who will be subjected to certain rules of behavior.
I think that was the concern coming in, Pat. And it was even like, why would you talk with Putin about, for example, jointly talking and working on cybersecurity, which in effect would be, sitting down to draw up the rules of the game with the criminal. But in fact, what I took out from what Biden said yesterday was a bit different. And that is, look, let's be clear, first of all, that Vladimir Putin, who was very much on the defensive yesterday, and that was interesting. The first time in years he's been on the defensive, was making these false comparisons. No one inside the United States has carried out an attack which included 9 government agencies, more than 100 U.S. companies, and American infrastructure. The Russians did through Operation SolarWinds and other operations. Then when it came to Biden's turn, what I think he effectively said is, look, we know these attacks come from other areas, but these were state-directed attacks. And I think, again, one of those lines that you just want to sort of highlight is when a reporter said, what happens if the Kremlin doesn't stop and if they attack U.S. infrastructure? Biden just looked point blank at the reporter and just simply said, Putin knows that we have significant cyber capabilities of our own. And that was sufficient to say, I think, you're on notice, President Putin. This stops now.
In other words, there will be retaliation and they won't know where it's coming from, but they'll, I suppose, draw the conclusion, just as the Americans do about Russian attacks. The Russians will know where it's coming from and that there are smart boys working for the United States government who can do them harm. And in other words, if you break the rules of the game, well, we'll break them too. Is that the message?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Biden, I think, would put it in a different way. And he'd simply say, look, we're upholding the rules from the start here, which is we're going to talk to you from now about a system of cybersecurity, but you halt these attacks. But if you cross the line and you continue the attacks, you cannot get away without paying a price. Now, I will say also, Pat, because I think some of your listeners will quite rightly bring it up, the United States has carried out cyber attacks of its own in recent years, notably, for example, against Iran over, the question of the nuclear file. That doesn't justify those U.S. cyber attacks, and it'll be interesting whether the Biden administration, as it were, sets up its own rules of the road for its own agencies. But again, what we were talking about yesterday specifically has been years of Russian cyber attacks linked to their attempt to undermine electoral systems as well as infrastructure. One pointed example being, and everyone knew it who was there yesterday, the Russian intervention in the 2016 U.S. election.
There are some people on the right wing suggesting that even Biden meeting Putin was blessing him with a recognition, boosting his image on the world stage by the very fact of the summit. But of course, they didn't say that at the time of Trump and Helsinki.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to try to leave the previous occupants of the White House to the side because we know what a train wreck that was. I had concerns, Pat, going into this, whether Biden, should meet Putin, because it was quite clearly from Russian state media, in other words, Kremlin media, for months, that they wanted this media precisely to give the idea that Putin has legitimacy, that Russia is an equal power to the United States, and that despite everything that they've tried to get away with in recent years, in effect, Biden had pushed that to the side. So after Putin's press conference, with these ludicrous comparisons, for example, that the attempt by the Kremlin to assassinate the opposition figure Alexei Navalny was somehow equivalent to Black Lives Matter protest in the United States, I wanted to see what Biden would come out with. Would Biden, in fact, accept that Russian line, which is, hey, what's the big deal here? We're going to be friends and everything. And the very first paragraph, the very first sentences of Biden's statement came out forcefully and said, look, here's what I came to do. I came here to set out that there are fundamental values, that there are fundamental principles, that we're not perfect, but these have to be upheld. Putin hasn't upheld these. He hasn't created that type of state we have. Now the question is up to him. Are you going to, at least in the international community, adhere to these principles? And I think with that message from the very start, that in a sense changes the dynamic. And it was very interesting that the Russian media took a step back yesterday after that and kept emphasizing, no, we want a constructive relationship.
Some of the texters, I've never seen the USA so weak on world affairs since Obama. Scary times. Says one, Biden the worst US president since Carter. The US needs to be muscular with China. Your guest must remove his rose-tinted Biden-loving eyewear. Biden had many gaffes on this trip and has lost the upper hand to Putin. We know where those texts are coming from, and I read them out simply to avoid the accusations that I don't read them out. But what's your response?
Yeah, I mean, we know the talking points, right? But here's two things I would say to get some substance out of those well wishes. The first is, even those folks with their particular point of view could not talk about Sleepy Joe yesterday when you talk about that press conference. That was a man who was on point. That was a man who wanted to get his message across. And secondly, here's the substance where I think, in fact, well, I'll actually agree with one of those texts partially. I think the statement that Joe Biden gave yesterday should have been given by Barack Obama years ago in the face of these Russian activities. I think Obama should have been more forceful. He should have been more forceful over the Russian annexation of Crimea. He should have been more forceful about the Russian intervention in the 2016 U.S. election. He should have been more forceful about Russia basically using its military to kill thousands, tens of thousands of civilians in places like Syria. He wasn't. The Obama mistake in 2009 was the idea of a reset in relations with Vladimir Putin after Russia's war with Georgia and after Russia's attacks, including cyber attacks, they were around even then, on the Baltic states, places like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Obama kept saying, okay, we can reset everything. We can all put this behind us. Biden didn't make that what I think was a mistake yesterday. He didn't say we could put this behind us. Instead, what he said is 6 months from now, out of our mutual self-interest, we're going to see where we are with the clear idea, which is in those 6 months, will we get to the rules of the road or in 6 months' time, do you have to conclude that Putin's going to keep trying to push back? He's going to keep meddling in other countries, and then you have to decide on your response.
All right. And of course, the ambassadors are now going to be reinstalled in the capitals, and that will at least allow diplomatic conversations to take place, which may lead to something. But we shall see. Time will tell. Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University of Birmingham, Editor-in-Chief of EA Worldview. Thank you very much.